Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and hopefully entertain you about the ever-turbulent games industry. As always, my name is Zach, and I'll be one of your hosts.
My name is Aaron, also one of your hosts.
Wow, we miss one single upload, and suddenly I forget the intro in a few different ways by trying to add some spice. Regardless of my embarrassment, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in, whether you be a new or a returning listener. Thank you. And also, I would like to say, please like and subscribe, whatever the button happens to be on the platform that you are listening to us on. In addition to that, please give us a share with a friend, or as we always like to say, a mortal enemy.
I always say that mortal enemies are just friends you haven't shared a podcast with yet.
That is true. To run the analogy into the ground from, I believe, the last episode, if perhaps Sauron was shared the wonderful podcast SPR, I was trying to think of one that wasn't us, perhaps an entire conflict for Middle-earth could have been, in fact, avoided.
We don't know.
We don't know.
The facts are inconclusive. We just don't know.
Yeah, the facts aren't in. Science hasn't dug into that yet. But regardless of us making a bunch of very bad jokes at the beginning of this episode, what we're talking about today is no laughing matter. Don't laugh, Aaron. It's not funny.
Nope.
And by that, I mean we're talking about the Sony talks with Kadokawa about purchasing them and becoming the owner of FromSoftware amongst, a bunch of different things. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. We're going to be, at least by our standard, trying to speed run it. So we'll see how successful that goes. But generally speaking, this was a story that came out, I believe it was early last week as an exclusive on, I think it was Reuters, wasn't it, Aaron?
Yep, that was where the story first broke. Was on Reuters that Sony was in early negotiations with the company Kadokawa to acquire majority stake in that company and thus become the business daddy of FromSoftware, amongst others. It was then subsequently reported by every fucking buddy. Yeah,
well, because of course people are going to jump on that. I mean, it's a massive franchise. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you're not familiar with FromSoft, they are the developers of the, one, Elden Ring, and then Dark Souls, and also Demon Souls, which are these, incredibly punishing games that a lot of people love, partially for their difficulty, but a lot of people will describe it as, basically kind of overcoming an obstacle and learning how to, achieve success, basically. Like, that's the big reward is, smacking your head against this boss, 5, 10, 15, 105 times, and then finally being able to beat them. And that feeling of accomplishment you get from that. That's really a big component of what FromSoft tries to push in their games. And then in addition to that, they actually also make the Armored Core games. I'm not as familiar with those. Those are not as popular as the Souls games. But I think it would be fair to say that at least Dark Souls spawned this whole new genre of what we call Souls-like games.
Yeah, I think it's worth pausing here for a moment to just very briefly talk about the impact of the Souls formula, starting with Demon Souls, popularized by Dark Souls, and then carried through a solid handful of other games developed specifically by FromSoftware, including Bloodborne, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, and then subsequently Elden Ring, which is the biggest game, whatever. It's massive in the last few years, and this company generated a mechanic nothing is wholly original. So it's born slightly out of roguelikes. It's born, slightly out of just like your standard action RPGs, but it came together into this brand new style of game that not only had people not seen before, suddenly almost every other game was emulating to some degree. If you have played a game in recent times where you collect a resource by defeating enemies that you use to upgrade, but if you die before you can spend those resources and drop them, that came from Souls. A lot of the staples of the combat in these games have bled into other games, including like the Jedi Survivor game. Jedi Survivor and Jedi Fallen Order are really, prominent examples of that, along with about 75 billion others. So the point being, these games are a massive deal. They sell very well, and they have had an enormous amount of influence over the gaming industry at large for well over a decade. This has been one of the dominant creative forces inside of video games since what, Xbox 360, PS3 era?
I think it was Xbox 360 is when the first Dark Souls came out, because Demon Souls was popular, but it was much more of like a
it was a sleeper
classic
hit.
Yeah. And some other drama kind of surrounding some of this is actually around the Game Awards, where Shadow of the Erd Tree, which is the expansion of the most recent FromSoftware game, Elden Ring, is up for nomination in one of the categories. And there's been this whole big discourse on whether a DLC for a game should even be considered for an award. So look into that if you're curious about any of the stuff that we're talking about today.
More specifically, it's up for Game of the Year. Not, best expansion or best ongoing game or anything like that. They literally changed the rules. Not that the rules at the Game Awards have been anything steady for any amount of time. The Game Awards have always been very nebulous with their rules, so people who are getting really frustrated about the sanctity of the awards ceremony are barking up the wrong tree, in my opinion. But the gist of it is, this expansion was apparently such a towering success that they literally changed the rules to make an expansion eligible. An expansion that you can't even access in the game until you've defeated a bunch of fairly difficult bosses somewhere in the latter thirds of the game. That is now eligible for Game of the Year. So, yeah, there's that.
So, yeah, FromSoft, as you can see, there's a lot of interest, a lot of passion around this. And now Sony's looking to purchase Kadokawa, which is the parent company for FromSoft, along with a bunch of other things. Just some examples is they own quite a few manga/visual novel publications, and then a bunch of anime studios as well, and some film projects. I wasn't able, and granted, I didn't really dig that far into the film project side of things because that's kind of outside of the scope of this conversation, but they own a lot. And just to give some examples that people might understand from like the anime side, is they are the ones that own Re:Zero, which is a really popular anime, the incredibly popular Delicious in Dungeon, which was a anime between in partnership between Kadokawa and Netflix. So it's actually on Netflix. It did super well. People love the show, super popular. Konosuba, which is another popular anime. And then there's an anime called Overlord, which I think super neat. I actually don't know if it's as popular as the other three that I just mentioned. But point being, they own a lot of different companies, they being Kadokawa, outside of FromSoftware. And I think it's important to mention that it's actually Sony, like the big S Sony, not just PlayStation, that's looking to make this purchase. So if you watch a few different videos, it's really easy to think Sony's just doing this for FromSoftware, especially after, Aaron and I just glazed up all of the Souls-like games for so long. But it's actually more likely that this is a larger portfolio decision where they actually, oh my gosh, sorry, that was a weird cough, where they actually want to acquire all these different anime properties and publications and all of that, because they view that as a solid way to become a monolith within the kind of wider anime visual novel area. And then, of course, FromSoftware is just kind of like the large amount of cream on top.
Yeah. If there is one really big get out of this entire thing, it would be FromSoft and its library of games and its future output, which it carries with it some implications that we'll dig into in a sec. But Yeah, I mean, realistically, Sony is already a player in the anime space, and they want to continue to expand even further out into the wider entertainment world. So it makes sense that Sony, as a mega corporation, would want to acquire the entirety of Kadokawa and all of its subsidiaries so that it can fold those into its already existing production pipelines and beef out its already existing portfolio. If they didn't have interest in those things, then it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine that either Sony or specifically PlayStation Studios would just buy out Kadokawa's 70% stake in FromSoft, which theoretically would be, substantially, if not substantially, then at least, to some degree less expensive. So it's evident that Sony sees value in the entirety of the portfolio. Otherwise, it wouldn't probably be making a decision on this scale. And we would be probably seeing still just exactly the same headlines because FromSoft generates a much more clickable headline than Kadokawa.
And to your earlier point, and the one thing that I mentioned, because I alluded to it and you specifically said it, among probably other companies, we didn't do a deep dive into Sony's holdings when it comes to anime and manga, but they do own Crunchyroll, and they also own Aniplex. And Crunchyroll's an interesting situation because there was this whole merger with Funimation that happened in 2020, 2021. And I actually remember there being a lot of drama around that because corporate consolidation, we've talked about it a lot. So this would be another case of corporate consolidation, not only in the games industry, but also in the visual novel and visual novel, manga, anime space, which I'm assuming has the same kind of negatives that we've talked about on other episodes. So it's not as big of a merger as Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard, but it seems to be somewhat of a big deal still.
Well, the crazy thing to me is that I think in terms of fan and general community engagement, I was actually going to bring this up, and I will try to keep this as brief as I can. The Activision Blizzard Microsoft merger was the biggest acquisition, I think, in the history of tech in general. At just shy of $70 billion, which is obviously an astronomical amount of money, but that speaks to the insanely large portfolio that Activision Blizzard as a publisher conglomerate has. What we're talking about right here for Sony is realistically not just one studio, because there are a handful of other studios that Kadokawa owns, including one ironically called Acquire, that have mostly done some smaller work on games like Octopath Traveler with Square Enix. They recently did Mario and Luigi Brothership for Nintendo. So not exactly the marquee titles that, would generate the headlines of a FromSoft. But within the context of just FromSoft, it does kind of speak to that single studio's outsized impact on the industry and how much its games have connected with players across the world, that the reaction to this news has been arguably, I wouldn't necessarily say on par with the Activision Blizzard acquisition, because I doubt that the FCC is going to be as stringent with this, because there's no way that the price tag is going to be so high, and the degree of control is not going to branch into Call of Duty territory to the point where it becomes arguably monopolistic. But the impact on the player base, the reaction there has been almost on the scale of the Activision Blizzard merger, which does, again, speak to how did FromSoft become, outside of just really making good games, they became such a pillar of the industry that this news is really shaking a lot of people. And I find that kind of fascinating.
Well, I think part of that, too, is we alluded to why the Dark Souls games have been so impactful. The one thing we haven't really talked about, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on, or I'm not rather, is the Dark Souls community is incredibly fucking vocal and incredibly fucking toxic sometimes. Not all of them are toxic, but certainly a portion, if you've ever heard Get Good or I actually don't know if the Touch Grass comes from Touch Grace does because it's an Elden Ring thing, but there's all these memes kind of like Sus came from Among Us, right? Largely that have come from the Dark Souls games. And specifically Get Good is the big one. And, part of that's just it's this vocal, passionate group of people. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we're hearing a big uproar here, just because, there's always going to be a big uproar whenever it comes to Dark Souls games. A new one comes out and then that whole issue around like accessibility versus scale or, not scale, difficulty, comes up. And, we hear that every time and it becomes this big thing. But what I think's more interesting than that is you talk about the Activision Blizzard situation, right? And I think in a lot of ways, people that are Blizzard fans were kind of hopeful for that acquisition in some way because they saw Bobby Kotick, they saw the bad stuff that was happening under his, for lack of a better way of putting it, administration. And they were hoping that, Phil Spencer was going to do a better job, that Microsoft and Xbox were going to treat people better and do all this other stuff better. That is not the situation with Sony purchasing Kadokawa and more specifically FromSoftware. Like Blizzard was kind of in its death saving throes in some ways. FromSoftware is kind of at the top of their game right now. Like Elden Ring could possibly be the best game they ever make. Like it has been so widely praised, so universally loved, much more accessible than some of the other games. It's not unreasonable to think that that's kind of the pinnacle of their achievement. Now, I'm not trying to shit on them by saying that, but it's just such a successful game. It's probably going to be hard to do better than that. So, Blizzard was in a much different situation when they were getting bought by Microsoft in terms of leadership. And FromSoft is in a much different situation because they're at the top of their game. And also, Sony's not really beloved by everyone at this current moment. We've talked about some of it with like the PS5 Pro and that being kind of a wet noodle and some of the other business decisions. But I think that juxtaposition is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that is worth bringing up as we kind of pivot into our thoughts on the implications of this potential acquisition, because if Blizzard was kind of at the nadir of its trajectory, there was really nowhere for it to go but up in a lot of people's eyes. Its reputation had fallen, I would say, fairly substantially from its heyday. There were, issues with a lot of their games, and it needed a refresh. It needed a refresh. It needed new management. It needed a bunch of different things in order for people to start to feel really confident that they would be heading in the right direction. Now, whether that has panned out is entirely up for debate, but perception at that time was largely optimistic to some degree. Again, I think you're right. It is, if not, even if it's not the case that Elden Ring is going to be considered FromSoft's magnum opus, right? The best game that they ever put out. It's possible that they will just continue to surpass themselves with each subsequent game. It's possible that they will continue to learn lessons from each game they make and incorporate them into increasingly grand, refined experiences. So that is still very much on the table as a possibility, but we can't argue that. I think FromSoft is, at least for the moment, at the height of it's at the top of its game. It's not to say that top cannot continue to go higher. It is just to say that FromSoftware has never been more popular than it is right now. It has never ridden a wave of success like the one that it's riding right now. And it has never had more potential to do really whatever the hell it wants with its next game than it has right now. I mean, after Elden Ring, they did release Armored Core 6, which was profoundly well-reviewed, not nearly as well-played as Elden Ring, but still very well-reviewed. So where are they going to go from here? They could go wherever they want. Shadow of the Erdtree is a massive success, both critically and commercially. And they are rewriting the rules for award shows, or rather rules are being rewritten for them. So yeah, it does feel very strange for Sony to, well, it doesn't feel strange for Sony to hop in at this moment. It's just a pretty significant contrast to the way that Microsoft did things with Blizzard. And yeah, Sony is not exactly at its most beloved at the moment, between Concord, between various PSN login things to do with Steam, and just the overall perception that the Sony umbrella is not a safe haven, as, you know, we all knew it wouldn't be, but it's not a safe haven, much like Microsoft isn't, and that they are still very fallible. And then I would even layer in the sparsity of content for the PS5 from Sony's first-party studios, I think has left a lot of people feeling... what's the word I'm looking for? I think that they, with lack of evidence to support their claims of quality, people are starting to just look at cracks because there's not content to fill them right now. So yeah, Sony is not exactly riding the PS4 wave anymore, as we've kind of discussed on the show. So it's possibly the worst time optically for Sony to pick up a studio as well respected as From, but the implications are, you know, kind of out of our hands, but certainly not out of our minds.
Well, I think kind of an interesting thing is if we think about one of the last big acquisitions that PlayStation did with Bungie, that's largely been a shit show. And
yeah, exactly.
That's mostly been on Bungie. At least that's what a lot of the research suggests and news that I've seen suggests. But the thing is that doesn't matter to a lot of consumers, because all they'll see, or gamers, I guess is what I should say, they'll see Sony bought Bungie, and Bungie was not in a good spot before Sony bought them. But then all these issues happen post Sony buying Bungie. That's going to look bad for Sony, even if they're not the ones directly responsible. So, you know, you look at a situation with like Kadokawa and FromSoftware. Kadokawa and FromSoftware, they've got this good thing going on. Whatever it is, I don't know what that organization structure, that leadership structure looks like, but it's natural for people to be a little bit nervous, because if FromSoftware is doing fine, doing what they're doing right now, why change it? And we hear tons of stories, especially because Aaron and I read a lot from Jason Schreier and have read some of his books specifically, not just news articles. We hear all the time about studios getting bought up and then the publishers or their owners saying, we're going to be hands off. We're not going to touch anything, right? Well, maybe that works for a few years, but then let's say that FromSoftware misses a critical deadline. Sony starts getting nervous. Sony might start, you know, micromanaging a little bit more than they were supposed to, or, you know, allocating resources in a way that FromSoftware doesn't like. It's a situation where you just hear these stories all the time. And that's not to say that it doesn't work out and owners don't get their hands too involved with the studios, but you're adding risk if you're, you know, from a fan perspective. And I think that that's something that people are quite a bit anxious about, especially with, you mentioned Concord being such a monumental failure, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, one that will probably be taught in business classes for a very long time. I think, generally speaking, I think that my opinion of this potential acquisition is very poor. I'm actually going to start with a couple of pros just to get them out of the way. I do think that there is potential that if this were to go through, that we could see a larger strategy start to take form, where once FromSoft is looped into the Sony ecosystem, we will see the Bloodborne franchise come back. It's possible that Sony has had their eye on From for a while, and they've been sitting on Bloodborne until they can eat the entire pie, as it were, for all of their games, and, you know, get that whole thing, you know, rolling again. That's always possible. It is possible that Sony would remain hands-off and allow From to just continue to enjoy its autonomy. And that would be great. I still think that we'd have to deal with the implications to the industry at large. But we have discussed corporate consolidation on this show 150,000 times, so I don't think we need to belabor the topic there. But I think across the board, the reason that so many people are so worried about this acquisition is mostly what you've been talking about. I think it comes down to whether or not Sony will remove what seems to be a pretty profound degree of autonomy from because, to all outward appearances, it seems that Kadokawa is just letting From cook. They're just saying, you keep bringing the hits and we will let you do whatever it is you're doing because it's clearly working. And with a company like Sony that is so obsessed with its overall strategy and with its portfolio and needs to hit these deadlines and has more pressure on it than something like Kadokawa, the fear that Sony will become more involved is, again, natural, and I think could be catastrophic to whatever magic sauce is making these From games come out as consistently as they do work, right? So if that does come to pass, then Sony will be the villain of the industry until another headline comes along. But I think that's basically just like the root of the concern, and I think that's totally justifiable.
Well, I think it goes a little bit beyond that as well, because we have to keep in mind that, especially for Elden Ring, right? The player base for Elden Ring is much more than just PlayStation players.
Oh, yeah.
It's Xbox. Technically it's all Xbox, right? Because my computer's an Xbox. My phone's an Xbox. If you don't know, I'm making a joke because their new push is everything's an Xbox, even your PlayStation. Actually, I think that's maybe the one thing that's not an Xbox, but
yeah.
Regardless, there's a lot of people that play on not PlayStation. And I think that a lot of people would be very ticked off if anything that FromSoftware does becomes an exclusive. And I would actually venture to say, because a lot of these people that I think are more vocal or even PC players, I would venture to say that they may be so spiteful that they don't even buy a PlayStation to play the game early, but they instead just slam Sony over and over
guaranteed.
Again. Because some of these people are so vocal, they're so spiteful, I could just see that being the case. And so I think that's part of the concern, is it being an exclusive. Now, I don't see a world where a FromSoftware game doesn't eventually come out on PC.
Except for Bloodborne.
At the moment. But that's
at the moment.
Yeah, there's some stuff there, but I don't see any Dark Souls game or new Elden Ring game not coming out on PC.
Right.
But what might happen is it comes out a year later, right? And here's another thing that Sony has had issues with. Their PC ports have sometimes been good and other times been really, really bad. And so that's another concern here is, are they going to say, okay, FromSoftware, you're really just building this game for PlayStation. We're going to worry about PC later. Because if that's the case, we may get a bunch of really bad FromSoftware ports. And yeah, that looks bad on Sony, but that's going to hurt FromSoftware and their image as well. So I think that's the other issue here. And I think the other thing that you alluded to, and I almost forgot about, is this whole PlayStation Network thing. So for those that don't know, not every region can log into a PSN account. You might have to keep me a little honest on this, Aaron, because this isn't an area that I know a ton about. But I know with Helldivers specifically, the issue was a bunch of people bought the game because they didn't know you would have to log in via PSN, and that included regions where PSN isn't set up. So when they made it so you had to log into a PlayStation Network account, you basically lost access to the game because your local region didn't have a PSN account. And so...
Correct.
Cool. Just making sure. So running with that, if they did that to Elden Ring, potentially some people can never play the new games, depending on what geo you're in.
Yeah, especially... granted, this is actually worth bringing up for FromSoft, and I'll keep it brief. The PSN system requirement really only matters 100% for networked features. So for Helldivers 2, which is an online game, it completely locked people out of the game altogether. Right, no one could play Helldivers 2 because you can't play that game offline. In the case of Ghost of Tsushima, which had another controversy surrounding this as well. The only content that was locked off behind PSN was the ancillary co-op mode that you could do over networks, but people in regions where PSN is not available could still purchase the single player campaign and play that on PC without needing to log into a PSN account. That having been said, FromSoft games, especially the Souls games, are very well known for their unique network features, which is to say leaving messages for other players, invading other players' games, fighting against other players, and summoning other players for support against particularly difficult bosses or in Elden Ring areas. So the question is, if the entire game is networked, are you just going to siphon off all of those network features and allow people to just play solo? Or are you going to partition off the entire game? Like, will the entire thing be blocked? There's a nice question mark there that I think leaves me a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. And for such a popular game, Sony will get a massive amount of backlash if they do that. And I think it's not of all the bets I would make, I think there is a decent chance this game isn't exclusive, but I would say it's a coin flip. I would bet a coin flip on that. I would say if it isn't exclusive, it will be on PC eventually.
Yeah.
The PSN thing, that's almost a certainty.
Yes,
in my
guaranteed.
opinion, that there will be some kind of feature set that is locked behind PSN. And obviously for us, Aaron, that's not really going to impact us, since we're not in one of the regions that doesn't have access. But that
like
sucks
as
for everyone else.
Yeah, as Americans sometimes like to forget, not everyone lives in America.
Yeah. Famously, most of the world actually doesn't live in America.
Yeah. a small portion of the population, called most of it does not live in America.
I think I'm kind of like going through our notes here. I think the only other kind of big thing in here that I've seen, and I brought this to your attention, but I've been watching a lot of Moist Critical or Charlie on YouTube, and he made a few videos regarding Sony hates Bloodborne. He made another one called Don't Do It, which is in relation to the specific story that we're talking about now. And there are a few things that he talks about in that, and I just wanted to bring up some of the things real quick that I think are unreasonable. And I like Charlie. I think he's a good guy. But I wanted to bring these up because I think he's kind of a good barometer for what the general gaming community is thinking. And he specifically mentioned that he thinks Sony's going to put a bunch of live service stuff into Elden Ring. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Sony does want more live service games, but I think that they're smart enough to know when it fits and when it doesn't fit. And I think that the failure of Concord it has to do with live service, but it's not them trying to push it into like a single player game where it doesn't make sense.
Right.
So I'm not really worried about them turning it into a live service game.
I don't think they're going to I don't think they're going to do an EA BioWare situation, because whether Concord failed or not, it did. Firewalk was a studio founded to make that game, basically, right? So they were theoretically equipped to make a live service game. This was not the case of Sony looking at a legacy studio with a history of making strong single player RPGs and saying, hey, make a live service looter shooter. That was not the case with Concord, and it was not the cause of its failure. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that Sony would push, because of the network features that are so present in Souls games. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that some exec at Sony would see dollar signs in, let's say, an Elden Ring style MMO. But I also don't think that I don't want to think that they're dumb enough to misallocate resources by making FromSoft work on. I mean, I'd hope anything other than what they want to work on, but realistically, like live service-ifying Elden Ring, I don't see that as being a likely outcome.
I think that they put too much emphasis on their strong portfolio of single-player narrative games. And granted, the Souls games narrative is there, but it's more ambient. It's not being told to you in the typical way that most Sony games would do it. But regardless, I just don't think that they do it. I think they understand what Elden Ring is enough to not force live service into it. Obviously, there were some like Last of Us games where they were trying to take that IP and make it a live service, but for the main Last of Us games, I think they're too smart to do that, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
We'll see. I would say I think that's not a concern that people need to have if they like FromSoft games. The other thing that came up in those videos and just from the community, right, is a lot of concern because of Sony's treatment of Bloodborne. So Sony owns the IP for Bloodborne. And that's been kind of stated by FromSoft as the reason that they haven't made a sequel or a PC port is because it's kind of out of their hands. They don't own the IP. And Charlie said in a lot of his videos that he thinks Sony hates Bloodborne. They're never going to make a Bloodborne game. I talked with you about this, Aaron, not necessarily a Charlie thing, but Bloodborne. I think that they will make a new Bloodborne game, or at least a PC port. I'm of the opinion that they know exactly how much hype they could get around the game because they did Demon Souls, right? Which is much more of a sleeper hit than Bloodborne. And I think they're just sitting on it until there comes a time where it makes sense. Which is my way of saying, in my mind, I think they're just sitting on it in case they need like a big boost in revenue. And they're like, all right, let's hit the emergency button, Bloodborne edition. We need a big cash inflow. So I wouldn't be concerned about Bloodborne coming out. I would say I don't think it's unreasonable to be cynical about how they're treating the IP, though, because I am of the opinion that they're probably just going to use it if they feel like they really need a big cash infusion, which would make sense because, like you alluded to, Aaron, they've promised like at least one big title every year. So let's say one year they don't have a title and it's like, well, Bloodborne on PC or something, right? So
yeah,
I don't know.
I would be astonished if Sony, a company that exists ultimately to make a great deal of money, was looking at the performance numbers for Bloodborne on PS4, which were very good enough to make it one of their like PlayStation hits ones that comes out with a little red banner to make it look special. That game performed very well for that platform. They've expanded out into PC in an aggressive way, and those ports have done very well for them. They went to the trouble of remaking Demon Souls as a tech showcase for the PlayStation 5. My opinion of it is that they are sitting on Bloodborne so that they can do something big with Bloodborne. Now, I do think that because it's maybe not the thing that's at the front of everybody's minds, they are also sitting on it to some degree. For when there is a gap in the schedule, but my suspicion is that they are going to announce either a full-on Horizon Zero Dawn style remaster of the game that is upgraded for PS5 Pro and, integrates the haptics, and then will subsequently be followed by a PC port, probably announced at the same time, but coming out at a later date. And then that will be the thing. Now, I also think that there is a possibility that, if not before, then certainly now, they would be sitting on that idea until a potential acquisition of FromSoft came through. Because if they had full control, I mean, they have full control over the IP, they own the IP, but if they had full control over the studio at the same time, and, didn't need to futz around with any like Bandai Namco, I think would probably go out the window as a publisher at this point, so they wouldn't need to worry about that. All of these different things that could come together into expanding Bloodborne as the PlayStation Souls IP, the FromSoft game that started on PlayStation, has come back home. I think that's a lot more likely than a bunch of people who love money looking at a bunch of money just sitting on a table and not taking it because they have some like deep-seated grudge against Bloodborne. Like maybe Sean Layden was like, too much blood.
It's possible.
I doubt that. No. I doubt that very much. I like Little Big Planet.
Hey, I've heard good
I like the way the Sackman jumps. That's not what Sean Layden sounds like. But I really doubt that that's the case. I think that they are sitting on the IP and planning to do something with it, possibly when it is more financially prudent for them to do so.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of my kind of specific points that I had, I don't have anything else on my end outside of just saying, I'm not thrilled about more corporate consolidation in the video game space. It's kind of poopy, and I am definitely a fan of especially these incredibly successful studios remaining independent of the larger publishers, the Sonys, the Microsofts, the Take-Twos, the Ubisofts, all of that. I would prefer more separation, especially in the AAA space. So, yeah, I mean, really, that's kind of my biggest takeaway. I can't make any promises or determinations around whether or not Sony's going to ruin FromSoftware. I mean, I think whenever you see situations where a new owner takes over, you're always adding a level of risk that wasn't there previously. So I would say if things stayed the way they are now, FromSoft's probably going to continue to do relatively well until, maybe Kadokawa decides to be more handsy or, I don't know, make bad decisions. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's probably a decent sized chance that Sony acquiring FromSoftware does add some kind of negative element to the mix that could have a negative impact on the quality of any game that FromSoftware makes moving forward. It's hard to say. I'm not a fortune teller. I don't think Sony's like one of the dumbest publishers out there. Like if Ubisoft bought FromSoftware, I'd be like, oh, we're fucked.
Ubisoft can't even afford itself right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, aside from that point, but I think that's my biggest thing. We talked about our issues with corporate consolidation. I think it's ultimately bad for both the video game and probably the visual novel, manga, anime space. But I'm gonna take a guess, Aaron. I think it's gonna happen. At this point, I don't know that much about Japanese business specifically, so maybe there's something I'm not seeing. But I think since it's been proven that this is going on, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that this is going to go through and Sony ends up owning FromSoft.
Yeah, I don't know what sort of mindset the execs at Kadokawa have. And, looking at that as a complete unknown, I would have to imagine that if the check is big enough, and we certainly know Sony has the funds to write a pretty damn big check, that this will probably go through, right? If it is in somebody's financial interest for this to go through, it very probably will, because I don't think you have the, strength of the conviction and the strength of the identity of something like Nintendo. Like, if Disney came by and was like, I want to buy Nintendo, I think Nintendo would probably be like, no, we're not going to do that. But I don't know that Kadokawa has that same degree of, feet planted in the dirt, this is ours and we're doing it our way. So yeah, I'd say there's an above average chance that this goes through. I think that is ultimately to the detriment of all involved parties except for Sony's bottom line. But I'm not willing to go full on doom and gloom with this. I think there is been basically a coin toss. I think it's about a 50-50 chance that this really doesn't have a terrible impact, just a couple of minor annoyances. And then there's always the chance that it just starts to spiral out of control, and the release cadence slows down, the quality bar drops, and the reputation is, if you'll pardon the pun, tarnished.
Yeah, keep in mind I am of the two of us the Sony hater. And by that I mean I am definitely more critical of Sony than Aaron, and I don't even mean that in a mean way, by the way, Aaron. I just mean I think I'm always going to intrinsically be more critical of Sony than maybe the average person. So I'm biased in my thoughts for sure.
I understand that. I definitely don't trust Sony in this case at all. I don't. I don't think that this is a good idea. Well, I was explaining more. I think it's a great idea. What?
I was explaining more for the people listening, not even you. Yeah. It's like to explain some of that hopefulness that you have versus my kind of like negativity. Is that I am 100% biased, and I am willing to admit it.
But I just need to clear up now that I've said I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea on Sony's part. I think if I was a C-suite executive with a giant checkbook. The size of the check does not correlate to the size of the payment. But regardless, I had a bottomless bank account. Absolutely buying FromSoftware is a great idea. 100%. From the perspective of a publisher who wants to beef out its portfolio with great games and stay competitive in a field where Microsoft, despite releasing on multiple platforms, is still eating an increasingly large size of the pie with all of its insane number of acquisitions, buying FromSoft is a brilliant business decision. I personally don't like it, but I understand why they're shooting for it. Now, it's just going to be up to them to not fuck it up, is the bottom line. Do I have faith that they won't fuck it up? No, I don't. But I'm also not necessarily willing to, again, go doom and gloom with it. I think that there's potential that this does not end in full-on catastrophe. But I don't know. Again, I'm not a prognosticator. I know not what the future brings.
Well, I know something that the future brings, assuming that you've covered everything that you want to in regards to this.
Yeah. I said the word prognosticator. I got my good tarnish joke out for the people who've played Elden Ring. I'm pretty much done.
Sweet. Well,
we've gone 15 minutes over time.
Well, not over time. We were aiming for a shorter, but we're not at an hour yet. So before we sign off, I just want to do the usual thank yous. Of course, I'm going to say thank you to Dougie Art, who did the wonderful art for us, album art, a logo, etc. Please make sure to check her out on Etsy. With Dougie Art is the handle, and the Instagram, as I keep wanting to forget, is now Moss Cat Market. So Moss Cat Market on Instagram, at Dougie Art on Etsy. Check her out.
Yes, indeed. The name has changed. The art has remained good. The same can, of course, be true. The same is very much true of Beach Girl, except for the name change. They're still called Beach Girl, but their music is still just as good as when they were called Beach Girl before they stayed Beach Girl. You can, of course, find Beach Girl's great music anywhere that digital tunes can be procured, like YouTube, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, Spotify, Deezer. Is that one of them?
I don't even know what that is. Maybe.
I really hope I didn't just name something terrible. I have typed in deer with 3 E's.
He's promoting porn on this podcast. That's messed up. Anyway.
Am I? I hope I'm not.
You're not.
No, it's a music. It's a music and online streaming platform, Deezer. Yeah, and they're probably on there too. But do check out Beach Girl. And listen to them. It's good stuff, and you won't regret it as much as I regret taking a bet on Deezer.
Well, with that being said, and porn having been promoted on the show, I apologize, all you mothers out there. Aaron's a wild card. Thank you for choosing to listen to us on whatever wonderful day it is. This will be coming out, I think, right before Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And with that, I bid you adieu.
Indeed.
Goodbye!
I like the way the Sackman jumps. That's not what Sean Layden sounds like.